Yeah, we're recording. Okay, we're live. Hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the John Carter Brown Library Series JCB Reads. I'm Karen Wolf. I'm the director and librarian of the JCB, and I'm so glad to be here with Jordan Smith, who was a JCB fellow back in 2015-16 and has just completed this fantastic book, product placement here, The Invention of Rum, creating the Quintessential Atlantic Commodity, published, of course, by the University of Pennsylvania Press. So here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to introduce Jordan, and then Jordan is going to give us a bit of a talk for maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And then I'll come back on and ask Jordan a series of questions. I always ask the same questions of our authors. It's been fun to see how people answer these questions. And then we will open it up for Q&A. Okay, great. So let me tell you a little bit about Jordan Smith, who it is just such a pleasure to have here. Jordan, first of all, congratulations on the book. Very exciting. Jordan is an associate professor of history at Widener University, has earned his PhD at Georgetown University, and his work has been supported by, among others, of course, the John Carter Brown Library, but also the McNeill Center, where he held a Barrow Dissertation Fellow, and also the Bright Institute at Knox College. That's such a great program that they run there. And also the NEH through a fellowship at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And his work has been awarded by, among others, SHEAR, the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, with a dissertation prize for 2019, and the Agricultural History Society for Best Article. So with that very brief introduction, Jordan, welcome to back to the JCB virtually, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, just give me 1 second as I figure out the screen sharing. Um,
You're great.
Great. Um, so thank you so much for that introduction, Karen. I want to kind of just recognize kind of how Karen, both kind of in her current position and in her previous role, has been such an advocate for projects like this and helping, especially faculty who are doing a lot of teaching, also do this sort of work. I'll jump right into things here. When Nicholas Brown, George Benson, and Welcome Arnold joined forces in the 1780s to open a rum distillery in Providence, they joined many of their compatriots in combining the wealth and expertise gained through trade with the large-scale production of rum. Within a few years, however, their sanguine hopes began to sour. By April 1794, Benson and Arnold exchanged vitriolic letters. Incensed by how Arnold had bullied and abused the distillery foreman, Benson struck out at the distillery's co-owner. Alluding to a recent encounter on the streets of Providence, Benson wrote, "If I made mouths at you, as you childishly alleged, it was only perhaps an involuntary motion indicative of the ineffable contempt I feel for your principles and conduct." Dismayed, Arnold complained of the most scurrilous, insolent, and abusive letter. He fought back, comparing Benson to a puppy and threatening to give him a kick as we do other curs that don't move when they are spoken to. Yet this was more than a clash of personalities. In a deposition the following year, Arnold complained about a business where the ethic of disposability had gone too far. He claimed, "Sometimes the stills was pushed much too hard for profit when they were loading their vessel with rum. The stills was kept going day and night against my will, and we burnt one of our large new still bottoms for want of stopping to clean." This crumbling business partnership in Providence is undoubtedly part of an Atlantic history of rum in the 17th and 18th centuries. So too are the many other examples of free and coerced men and women who took part in the invention, production, trade, and consumption of rum throughout and sometimes beyond the ocean basin. This is the map that begins the book, and I'm really proud of it. Every place mentioned on this map comes up in the book. And I think it gives a sense of the geographic expansiveness with which I try to approach this question. I'm thrilled to share my book with The Invention of Rum, Creating the Quintessential Atlantic Commodity with the JCB community today. This is a book profoundly shaped by the rare book and manuscript collections of the JCB, the expertise of the library's curators, and the friendships that formed while living in Firing House in the fall of 2015. And I can't believe that was a decade ago. The Invention of Rum is my attempt to try to understand how a broad swath of inhabited terms with the abundance of new ingredients and ideas thrust together through the colonization of the Americas. It does so by piecing together the individual stories of free and enslaved Africans, indigenous actors, and British colonists who created, made, and moved one of the Atlantic world's most widely available and cheapest goods. Should you choose to read the book, you'll encounter 8 chapters organized around 3 themes. Those themes are creation, extraction, and I kind of cheat a little bit with the third one, but connection and conflict. In its totality, I see the book as an extended reflection on some of the central paradoxes that I see within Atlantic history. These include: how might we think about the relationship between the many examples of new ideas populating the Atlantic world and the undeniable forms of brutality that shaped it? How and why did people whose legal and natural rights were severely abridged find and act on opportunities to shape a globalizing culture of production and consumption? And in what ways did the profusion of things that could be bought and sold, or made and ingested, ultimately cause people to value those goods differently, and I would argue in some ways value them less? One goal of this book is to offer a history of rum that accounts for its place in the lives of almost everybody who inhabited the Atlantic world in the 17th and 18th centuries. This was itself a stunning development, precisely because rum originated as a creative means to redeploy the dregs left over after sugar was made. Understanding how and where sugar was made or rum was made and tasted helps explain many historical developments that an overemphasis on sugar alone might obscure. But even if you're not particularly interested in the history of rum or sugar per se, there's a broader lesson to be learned here. The very idea of rum's genealogy as a product of waste invites us to recenter our understanding of the societies and economies of the Atlantic world on how they were experienced, rather than how elites wanted them to be. The Atlantic world in which rum gained currency was a world coming to terms with the profitability of thinking and acting in immediate terms that saw objects and people as impermanent and replaceable. This strikes me as a quintessentially modern idea, which I argue was first worked out in the cane fields and rum manufactories of Barbados and Jamaica, Philadelphia and Providence, Edinburgh, London, and eventually India. I want to use the remainder of this time that I have with prepared remarks to share some of what I found as I conducted research in an array of archives. I consider myself as the stuffed rodent that I picked up at the National Archives behind me would suggest as an archive rat. Yet I recognize the incredibly vexed nature of how that archive was created. And my remarks here aim to provide some insight into how I approached these dual or dueling realities. At various times in this project's history, I thought about the idea of rum as a recipe, or thought about a recipe as a means of organizing the various aspects of the history I was trying to tell. And I have on occasion actually found recipes in the archives, in journals and almanacs and guides to distilling. Here's one example, and I'll show another example in a moment. But there are myriad issues with relying on recipes like these. They, of course, offer insight into best practices when the distillery was ideally stocked with supplies and people, and that was, of course, not always the case. Written recipes were additionally packaged in a form that many free and enslaved distillers could not access if they could not read. And this is a point that hit me kind of in the starkest terms when I was at the JCB. Kim Nusko generously processed pay receipts, even though she kind of wondered, and I think rightfully, what I would learn from those that I wouldn't learn from other account books. But what I learned is I saw a lot of names or receipts signed with X's rather than names, suggesting that a lot of these hired distillery workers could not write their own, or probably couldn't read or write. I'm going to show a different recipe now in a different form. This one, right, published in a guide to distillation, doesn't prescribe who would do the work. And I think it's really kind of stunning, the use of they and the passive voice throughout. So in order to kind of recreate this story or this history of how the work was done and who was doing the work and how they were thinking about, required me to systematically troll a litany of archives for short descriptions that peek out from documents created with very different purposes. On this front, material culture and images can also be instructive, although they too have to be interpreted carefully. And so I'm sharing two of the 10 views of the island of Antigua. And I talk about these in the book, and suggest that they're flawed in that they present an orderly plantation and an enslaved workforce as healthier and better dressed than other records would suggest. But the point about 25 people undertaking the various tasks in the distillery alone is hard to forget. This was a world of work. This is a long way of saying that my recipe for rum would look different than the recipes that I just shared. And in my limited time today, I want to talk about four ingredients at the center of my book. The first is sugary wastes. As I detail extensively in the book, rum was not a foregone conclusion. Instead, it took a creative reimagining to think of refuse sweeteners as an ingredient for anything. Early 17th centuries, European colonizers in the Americas came to different conclusions regarding the utility of damaged sugar canes and the molasses left over after sugar was boiled and cured. It was alternatively described as purely trash, animal fodder, a cheap sweetener, or even a source of a wine for enslaved people. But I've been unable to identify definitive evidence of its distillation into rum or something like it before that was carried out in mid 17th century Barbados. And even if distillation of sugary wastes was carried out earlier, I'm pretty confident that what went on in Barbados was a reinvention, and a reinvention that involved a number of different groups of people, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes. In Barbados and later Jamaica and Antigua, those sugary wastes came from the same integrated sugar plantations where most of the island distilleries were located. In England and Scotland, they emanated from the decks of incoming ships and sugar refineries that turned semi-refined sugars from the Caribbean into white table sugar. But in places like Providence and Boston, the sweets were leftover molasses barreled and shipped predominantly from non-British plantations, often French plantations. Late into the 18th century, mercantilist policy limited the conversion of molasses into alcohol in many non-British sugar colonies, and so that those sweets instead found new life in New England's dozens of distilleries. I think this is an important point to remember because the recipes for rum were similar, but not identical. And my book, which takes a wide geographic lens, has to also account at the same time for regional variability. The next two ingredients that I want to talk about cannot really be entangled. After all, in the 17th and 18th centuries, labor was expertise, and expertise was labor. Early chapters of the book unpack how a multiracial cast of people in Barbados merged geographically dispersed cultures of alcohol production into one. Their expertise included Kalinago women and also Tupi women and Arawak women who originated in South America and other parts of the Caribbean, who masticated cassava and fermented the slurry into an alcoholic brew. And this image comes from courtesy of the JCB collections, as do many of the images in the book. Knowledge of alcohol production in early Barbados also included palm wine producers, forced there by the earliest slave trading voyages from Angola, as well as English experiences fermenting and distilling grains. The need for expert workers only intensified after rum had been invented and commodified. On Caribbean plantations, there was often a hired distiller responsible for oversight and record keeping. However, inventories of enslaved populations made clear that enslaved men trained as distillers carried out the vast majority of the work in the distillery, aided by men and women who worked in the sugarcane fields, as well as trained coopers and sugar boilers. Yet this expertise was less often discussed. Let's take the manuscript guide to plantership, John Doveston's Agricultura Americana, which I consider to be one of the treasures of the JCB collections. Doveston painstakingly detailed how he built his expertise through conversation with scientists, alcohol producers, and plantation operators alike. When he discussed processes mastered by enslaved people, though, his reporting of conversations ended promptly. Instead, he simply observed, or so he said. By building a broad archival basis, my book seeks to reconstruct the artisanal expertise often at the heart of systems of slavery in the Caribbean and beyond, even when writers like Doveston, or I would argue sometimes historians today, allied such details. I also document how labor and expertise stitched together this Atlantic world. One story at the heart of this endeavor is that of an enslaved man named Quaco, who was initially enslaved in Barbados as a cooper before being transported to Boston and sold to a distillery operator. Through legal records, I center Quaco's experiences, reflect on how his expertise functioned differently in the Caribbean and North America, and tell a history of slavery that attempts to take enslaved skill more seriously than many prevailing interpretations. Quaco and men like him also serve as powerful reminders that distilleries were some of the most prevalent sites of enslavement in places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, often lasting later into the 18th century than we might guess. Even as gradual emancipation took hold, enslaved and emancipated Black men often labored in the rum distillery. The JCB's collections include references to another such man named Cuffy, who labored in the same Providence distillery that I began my talk with before his health faltered. One of the hardest questions to answer, though, remains that of how enslaved and coerced people experienced and thought about their work. In the book, I consider what it meant for enslaved people to be simultaneously producers and consumers of rum. I think through concepts such as Stephanie Camp's formulation of the intoxication of pleasurable amusement as a resistant activity. I also take seriously the words of enslaved and formerly enslaved men who worked in the vicinity of distilleries. In an early 18th century slave narrative, Ashton Werner evocatively described that dread that accompanied a threatened demotion from cooper to field laborer. And a deposition from Daniel Hopkins in 19th century Virginia defiantly struck back against a lawyer's claim that its illiteracy should discredit his recollection of distillery work. The fact that distilleries became targets of assault during revolutions of the enslaved offers further glimpses into how they viewed the work that they were compelled to complete within those spaces. As Thavolia Glimpf wrote shortly after this book went to press, if we look, we sometimes find the spectacular visibility and boisterous outcry of the enslaved in the archive. Here, unchecked by the expected decorum of the researcher, enslaved people reject the racism of the men and women who author most of the papers that have come to reside in authorized archives. The names of 18th century distillers who assembled these archives often doubles as a list of leading merchants in places like Providence, Newport, and Boston. This fact emphasizes the importance of the final ingredient that I'll mention today. Distillery operators entered the rum business well aware that their financial success necessitated finding ready audiences for their product. And the market for rum shows the most expansive view of this commodity. The invention of rum posits that the spread of rum consumption in the late 17th and 18th centuries was a vital part of its invention. The rather sudden availability of a cheap and strong distillate was often seen as a threat to traditional forms of authority. In Jamaica, rum-fueled debauchery caused observers to interpret the destruction of Port Royal in 1692 as a retelling of the biblical story of Sodom. In North America, increase in cotton mather alike fretted over the rising branch of what they called the Dead Sea, and hysteria unfolded regarding consumption patterns in native communities. In England and Scotland, the gin craze, pictured here, could have been more aptly called the rum craze at certain times and in certain ways. We absolutely must account for local specificities and the individuals who were consuming rum. But telling an Atlantic spanning story of makers and drinkers contending with new drinking patterns can help us move beyond essentialist narratives of the consumption patterns of certain groups of people as especially problematic. Of course, not everybody drank the same rum. That produced in the Caribbean and well-aged fetched the highest prices. The bottle shown here on the right ended up in the basement of a planter's house in North England. This is the bottle that the book begins with. The British Navy also invested in the financial stability of Caribbean plantations and sugar and rum making by instantiating the Caribbean rum ration as the sailors' right around the world. North American distilleries produced a less esteemed but no less well-traveled alternative. In anticipation of this talk, I reviewed my notes on the Brown Benson Ives distillery yesterday, and I quickly encountered letters regarding rum sales in North and South Carolina, North Atlantic fisheries, Philadelphia, Copenhagen, and the west coast of Africa. My book seeks to reconstruct what rum meant to people trading for and drinking it in these spaces, including among groups like the Akan people of the Guinea coast. Demand for New England rum in a place like the Guinea coast, where it was an important component of slave trading, reflected the matching of faraway sites of production to local tastes. This aspect of the history of rum in places like Rhode Island also provides, I think, a vital prequel to recent studies that link the economics of slavery to a broader geography. As I hope is evident from today's short talk, I have a lot that I want to tell you all about rum, more than could ever fit in 20 minutes. So I hope that some of you will seek the book out in your library or at a bookstore. In the book, you'll find an impassioned plea to take seriously how people came to terms with the emergence of what I consider to be the quintessential Atlantic commodity. By tracing the transatlantic history of something as quotidian as rum, seemingly disconnected events vital to the history of colonial America and the Atlantic world become united. Moreover, the invention of rum shows how much was being negotiated in the 17th and 18th centuries, who was involved in those contestations, and how they changed the lived reality for almost everybody. The most wide-ranging conclusions of this work might also speak broadly to aspects of the human experience across time. I'm going to conclude by reading just the final paragraph of my epilogue, which I hope offers an even more expansive view of what might be learned here, and one that I think can provide some critical insight into one of the things that I think many of us in academia are currently thinking about. This study should cause us all to think differently about how things change. It is tempting to suggest that a commodity can revolutionize the world, ultimately losing sight of the people inventing, making, resisting, profiting, and suffering. Those people experimented, they cooperated, they fought, they coerced and were coerced. They lied, cheated, and stole. They strove for something else. Ultimately, many more groups of people than we usually envision took part in conjuring a product and series of systems that continue to shape the modern world. Understanding human choice and creativity in these terms is crucial at a moment in time when many wonder whether technology can take on the most human of functions. So I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Jordan. That was great. And I love that you read from the epilogue. That is just like fantastic, like a kind of emphatic call to action, CTA, as they say in the business. It's great. Um, so I've got some questions which I'm eager to ask and to hear you speak to. But I also want to encourage folks who are attending. First of all, thank you all for being with us. And secondly, to use the Q&A function. Jordan and I will talk for about 15 minutes, then we'll have about 15 minutes, I think, for your questions. So Jordan, first of all, we were talking about this a little bit just before we started the webinar, but I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the origins of this project, which I know is something that matters to you.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because any project has multiple origins. But I was an undergraduate just as kind of the first Atlantic World textbook came out, and I remember seeing in the course catalog, I was so excited to take an Atlantic history course. I didn't know I wanted to be a historian, but the class kind of spoke to me in some ways and continues to speak to me. I was fascinated, as many people were, with pirates, and I recently wrote about this in Commonplace. And I wrote a senior thesis that tried to think about piracy through the spaces where pirates interacted with so many other people. And a big part of that was in taverns in Jamaica. And at some point, like, it's not that the pirates ceased to be interesting, but like that space and what people were consuming, what a broader swath of people were consuming, became kind of more interesting to me. So there was kind of that interest in the consumption of alcohol and where that took place and what it might have meant. And then I had an internship in college, and then I worked there after college at Mount Vernon, where I worked in a reconstructed 18th century distillery. And we tried really hard. We made whiskey, but we also made a huge mess. And I remember like cleaning up foam that would form if you added grains with the wrong temperature of water, things that weren't necessarily written down, and things that would have been kind of second nature to people working in those spaces, but might have kind of been lost in other kind of mediums. And that caused me to think a lot about kind of the material kind of process of making things and making alcohol. And so I think combined these interests in alcohol got me thinking. And then when it was one of those things that as I started thinking about research in graduate school, I thought that there was some excellent work on rum, but that talked about rum in specific contexts. And I wanted to tell kind of a more expansive and wide-ranging story about the history of rum.
I love that. Makes me think about all of that work on like the body of the artisan, like kind of
Yeah.
kinesthetic, like
Pamela
knowledge
Smith.
making,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
yeah, amazing, amazing. Um, okay, so uh, as you were talking, I was, of course, and as I was reading, I was thinking about like show the book again. There we go. I was thinking about histories of commodities. I was thinking about like foundational histories of commodities, which have emphasized, of course, sugar, like you know everything from Richard Dunn to I mean there's just such a rich body of literature focused on commodity production, but then also I think you were implicitly calling to the history of capitalism and my colleague Seth Rockman's book about the integrated nature of histories of slavery and industrial production and so on. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what kinds of contributions to scholarship you wanted to make and to build on in this work in particular.
Um, yeah, and I like in my mind, I want it to speak to a lot of different people. And I would say that I wanted to write a book that people um, would want to read. And so I'll start by saying, like, I do hope that people who have an interest in rum, both as a history, but kind of as a product of the Atlantic world and the world,
Yeah,
global economies to this day, find it
yeah.
interesting as well. Um, like as I kind of alluded to before, I think that um, rum was an integral part of the Atlantic world. And as I kind of, after 15 years about of working on this project, as the pieces finally started to really feel like they fit in place, I started to think about how everything from like tax structures to kind of the slave trade and where kind of New England slave traders tended to go. Like I thought all sorts of things started to make a little bit more sense to me. So
Mm,
I hope that people will realize that if you were writing a story of the Atlantic world and especially Britain's role in the Atlantic world, um, that they should think a little bit about rum and maybe
yeah.
pick up this book. But I was deeply swayed by a lot of work on commodities that, for understandable reason, tended to focus a lot on sugar.
Hmm.
And so I think like something that other kind of historians of rum have pointed out, the fact that maybe 20 to 40% of the value of sugar plantations was embedded in the rum,
Yeah.
like has to be taken seriously. Um, I also think that if we kind of go back to some of the classics as well, something like Sidney Mintz's Sweetness and Power,
Yes, that's what I was
um,
thinking of. Yeah.
yeah, I think
It's
that,
blinking. Yeah.
and I was rereading that with my students about a week ago, and Mintz kind of thinks that like the kind of broader market forces and kind of government forces are limiting kind of choice and
Mm,
limiting contingencies somewhat. And that's a place where, like, again, this is a book is a huge kind of inspiration, but I think I disagree. I think that
mm,
I want to tell a story of commodities being made and invented and made and consumed and traded that takes seriously how individuals are making choices. And they're
mm,
making choices that are constrained by race and gender and legal status. But they're making choices, and they have kind of they make decisions that influence what rum becomes. And
mm,
so it's not just mints, but I think generally I want to tell a kind of history of commodities that really emphasizes people and their
mm,
experiences. And I think to borrow a line from Nan Onstead in Cigarettes Inc., kind of peel back the mythos of modernity that sometimes
mm,
thinks about systems and thinks about technologies rather than people.
mm,
And again, I think this is a story. I for a long time, like I've been pushed to kind of engage with kind of in a more focused way with the history of capitalism, and there are ways in which I'm not sure, given kind of my work on the 17th and 18th centuries, I'm not always sure how that that fit works.
Mm,
But what I would say is I think that I've read that stuff, and I think it's really important. And I think this is a necessary kind of prequel to Seth's excellent work or Daniel Rood's work, where we
mhm.
see kind of a longer history of these questions of slavery and disposability and labor.
Yeah,
Um, yeah. So
yeah,
those are some of the
yeah.
things that I'm trying to
Thank you.
respond to.
Thank you. I was really I was going to ask you about well, many things. One, just on the point of the materials that used at the JCB, we're always thrilled when people are using the Brown Family Business Records because it's such an incredible resource. Like, we think the best documented, like full longitudinal study of a bunch of family related businesses.
Mhm.
And you'll be happy to know that we are doing even more work on getting finding aids up and out for those materials. So that's
Awesome.
very exciting for us. Yeah, it is really great. I hope you'll come back and work in them again soon. Um, I wanted to ask you. I was going to ask you about more about materials that you used at the JCB and to talk to you about that. But first, can you talk about that anecdote that you opened the book with? The Lassells and the auction, because that's kind of wild. And I think that really speaks to your point about how, rum is a commodity now that has obviously a big appeal. A lot of people like rum. They drink rum. They think about rum. They, and that's a group of people you want to speak to. And certainly that anecdote just smashes that right home.
Yeah. And so that was, as I think often happens, that was one of the last pieces to fall into place. I had an incredible set of readers' reports, and they encouraged me to give up the painting Sea Captains Carousing in Suriname and go for something different that really got at kind of what I thought
Mhm.
kind of the heart of the book was and what kind of Rum was telling us that was different. Um, I think that so I think that like the fact that rum is something that exists today and that is a really, really important part of many Caribbean kind of cultures and global kind of cultures of consumption is something that kind of has to inform the book in some ways. And I certainly don't want like I think that kind of thinking about kind of a holistic history about this doesn't take away from kind of those experiences and kind of the dearness that many kind of have toward rum. Um, but I think that this example kind of helps me kind of peel back on something that sometimes happens when we focus on a good, right? Where we could tell kind of a history of rum, or we could tell a history of every commodity that thinks about it as like craft or bespoke. And that's interesting. And I think like there are some really great examples of books that focus on those sorts of goods, on mahogany. Um,
Mm,
but something that makes rum different is how it was everywhere, and how
mm,
the even kind of the people who are in kind of the really kind of brutal circumstances of plantation slavery are also its consumers and some
yeah.
of its first consumers. And so I think that that kind of anecdote was a way to think about how it would be something that would be in the basement of Harewood House, and that could be turned into rum punch. But it was also something that could be consumed locally, and to think about kind of the convergence of those experiences and meanings.
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of a mind-blowing thing about like auctioning this stuff all these years later. That's bizarre. Yeah. Very telling, I think. Um, so can you talk a little bit about the materials that you used at the JCB and what you like what difference those materials made? You very kindly referenced that in your
Yeah.
introduction. We're just always keen to know, like, what difference did the materials make, and how can they be helpful to you and to other researchers?
So I think I came to I was trying to remember this. I came to the JCB uh, several times before I had a
Mm,
fellowship, once for the Sugar Conference, and then
mm,
also once I think I was at Rhode Island Historical Society, and they were closed on a day, so I came over to the JCB and I started with the Doveston manuscript,
mm-hmm.
and was like I remember talking to Kim in the reading room, but also was just kind of blown away by this manuscript that I knew I needed to spend more time with. So there are these manuscript collections that help kind of unveil a broader story of where rum was produced. And so kind of accounts of sugar plantations in the Caribbean, some that kind of detail specific work going on in the distillery. The Dovison manuscript for thinking about how ideas of rum and how to make it circulated around the Atlantic world and informed kind of production techniques elsewhere in the Atlantic world. The Dovison manuscript's a really vital source.
Mm.
And then I spent a lot of time in the Brown family business records. And so this anecdote obviously kind of informs the book in some ways, this like emphasis on disposability, the emphasis on, I have a chapter that thinks about kind of the rum trade and the slave trade. And it's informed in some ways by kind of what was going on in Rhode Island, which I think this gives an example of, even though some of the rum kind of leaving this particular distillery was used for kind of the quote unquote legitimate trade with places like Syria. But yeah, I think as you kind of mentioned, the breadth of the records within the Brown family business records, where you can find kind of people's pay receipts and kind of gain kind of these like very specific kind of insights into, some of them begin by signing with an X and later you start to see them write their names out. You see kind of references to people. One thing that I've been pushed by kind of colleagues to integrate since it was a dissertation was more on kind of the indigenous kind of experience of making and sometimes consuming rum. And, there's a receipt for somebody who's listed as, I believe, Edward Green the Indian in those sorts of records. So a lot of like the way in which I tried to build this project was that there's not, as far as I see it, one source that is critical for the project, but it's kind of taking the time to go through kind of all sorts of different archival collections and build kind of an understanding of rum from the ground up.
Yeah, accretion. It's great. Okay, I'm going to jump to a couple of questions and I'm going to come back to some of our questions here. But let me go to some questions that have come in through the Q&A. So Mark asks, first of all, thank you for this great talk. And a question about addressing popular ideas about rum in your teaching in public history, aka the Captain Morgan problem. Specifically, how do you navigate the tension inherent to historical work on what can be a romanticized and branded global commodity that nonetheless has deep ties to enslavement?
So I think that, and I talk about this a little bit in the epilogue, like my goal is to tell an honest history.
Mm.
And again, I have spent some time in Barbados and I have talked to kind of members of kind of diasporic communities who like there is an aspect of this story uh, of kind of a small, as sometimes it's thought of like a small island in the Caribbean, kind of being at the center of global kind of processes of invention, of telling
Mm.
a story of innovation in unexpected places and among a group of people that sometimes kind of historians might not have thought of as innovators. There is also a story of kind of the history of rum that is embedded in plantation slavery, the slave trade, other forms of violence and brutality. And so I think that kind of one goal is to balance those two things and to provide kind of I think, kind of painstakingly detailed and sourced kind of story of how rum was made and invented, made, traded, and consumed. Um, and so I think like I want to have these conversations with people, and I think people should want to have these conversations, and I think a lot of people do. And so I'm not sure if I'm entirely answering the question, but it's kind of
You're
the best that I
historicizing.
had. But I
Yeah.
would agree that
Yeah.
it's also like it is like it's tied to kind of questions of kind of popular history or not
Yeah.
popular history, but kind of the space of public history and museums and how we kind of think about symbols and things like that.
Thank you. Okay. Question from James is any data or info on injuries, illnesses of rum workers? For example, current sugarcane workers suffering kidney failure due to heat, and we know how incredibly dangerous sugar production of any kind was. Can you just talk about the dangers of rum production?
Absolutely. And so, you know, I've written I wrote a blog post a long time ago about this, and it kind of reappears in some form in the book. One thing that I try to think a lot about is how kind of a myriad cast of distillery workers would have experienced their work. And so these would have been incredibly warm spaces. These were some of the most, like, if you look at who's working in these distilleries, they were some of the most masculine spaces that I've kind of encountered anywhere in the Atlantic world.
Mm,
The distilleries themselves, even if they kind of depended on women kind of in other contexts. Um, and there are examples of kind of a highly flammable substance, often, sometimes being produced in low lit situations, kind of beyond kind of daylight hours of fires, explosions. And I try to talk about those sorts of things with great sensitivity, but I do think that they get at this kind of idea of a world that's coming to terms with disposability in new ways. Um, the chapter or the book also has kind of a component that focuses on environments and the environmental history of rum. And the rum is being made in stills that have lead in them, and so the prevailing interpretation is that when we see dry bellyache written about in records,
mm,
it's actually lead poisoning. And so those who are kind of close to a distillery are sometimes kind of consuming rum from that distillery and showing symptoms of lead poisoning as well, as are kind of British sailors who are supposed to be drinking this rum ration, which is aged rum, where the lead has usually had a chance to settle to the bottom, but are also kind of buying and otherwise sometimes stealing rum that has not been aged.
mm. Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. So all these different kind of ways that it was expensive, basically. Yeah, on persons and the environment. So question from Jesse. Hi, Jesse. Thank you for this talk, Jordan. What do you see as the state of the field today as far as the history of alcohol? So you mentioned more specialized histories of rum in the past, like maybe Frederick Smith's work, thinking of alcohol as commodity, like Jennifer Anderson's Mahogany, and thinking about alcohol production and commodification as a series of choices. And as a paren here, reminding Jesse of Hancock's Oceans of Wine. But where's the study of alcohol going? What's still missing? How, and if I can piggyback on that, how is it distinct from thinking about other kinds of commodities, labor regimes?
I, the thing that immediately comes to mind is the question of addiction.
Mm,
And I was, and I think here I follow the lead of Marcy Norton and some
mm,
other scholars where um, like my understanding of kind of the history of addiction is sometimes people would use the word addicted, but the general consensus was that one could stop consuming alcohol if they tried, or
mm,
stop consuming any other food drug if they tried. There are historians and scholars who have different interpretations of that question. And I think that, I think there's some really interesting work like Rum Maniacs, which looks at the 19th
mm,
century. But I do think, and I know there are people working on this, but I think kind of a longer history of kind of how like ideas of addiction and maybe even getting beyond the binary of
mm,
when people started to think about addiction. I'm really excited to see Lila Chambers' book when it comes out and thinking about kind of um, power and kind of capital and alcohol. I think that's going to be, one of our books had to come out first, and I'm glad my book came out when it did, but it would be a better book if I could read Lila's work first.
mm. Is there, I mean, this is comes from a place of not total ignorance, but some significant ignorance here. This is not what I know at a research level. But I mean, is this a different kind of commodity? Like, are all commodities so differentiated from one another that sometimes we have to say that these are not, you can't just lump together like sugar or rum or tobacco or cotton or salt or whatever. Like, we tend to think about these kind of single commodity focused studies as if they are not interchangeable, but the method, the approach, the whatever. But in fact, are they so distinct because they exist within these social, cultural, economic, and labor systems that are so distinct that we shouldn't think of them that way?
I think I agree, but I think like there commodity studies have become kind of enough of a thing, and they've existed for long enough that, for instance, right now I'm teaching a seminar on kind of a commodity history of the Atlantic world, and we focus
Mm,
on very different
mm,
kind of aspects of different goods to kind
mm,
of explore environmental history, social history, economic history, business history, cultural history. So what I would say though at the same time is I don't think I can think of a single commodity history that is only engaging with other commodity histories. They're engaging with incredibly granular work of kind of the communities where these commodities existed.
mm.
And I'm like, and sometimes those are other books that might not have been called commodity histories, but you can't really tell the history of South Carolina without talking about rice and
Yeah,
indigo.
yeah.
And I think, I benefited from that. I think Frederick Smith's book, John McCusker's dissertation, which was ultimately kind of republished as a book. These are really important studies that tell kind of stories or histories of rum in different parts of the Atlantic world. Jay Cottrey's Notorious Triangle as well.
Mm,
Um, and so, so yeah, I think that as much as we want to think of it as a field, it's influenced by uh, other books that sometimes weren't thought of as commodity histories, but are kind of
hmm. But now
giving
you
us a
put them
lot.
there. Huh. Do your students respond to particular of these? Like, are they particularly compelled by certain kinds of commodity study approach or actual commodity?
I was talking with them a little bit earlier this week about this, and I think something that they sometimes find hard to engage with is like they want to kind of be able to kind of think about and
Mm,
narratives, and so um, like they like commodity studies that also tell stories about people. I think that's right. I was also, and maybe this is uh, because of who's teaching them, and
mhm,
but some of them had also said that they really think foregrounding kind of the production of commodities
mm,
helps them understand
mhm,
what's going on.
mhm, mhm. I wonder if this is like as do we actually have a return at the moment to a kind of conscientious consumerism? I don't know, or are we just like talking about it at some level? But I wonder if that plays a role for them thinking about their own experience of consuming things that they may or may not have a good grip on how they're produced and the impact of those things. Is that a fair thing?
Yeah, and it's not kind of lost on me. I like that some of this project or much of this project kind of was developed in a moment where we were thinking a lot about like local food sources, right? So I'm trying to tell
Yeah,
this global story while at the same time, um, you know, feeling like going to the farmer's market and otherwise
yeah,
kind of looking for local sources of some of what we eat. So
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's super interesting. Um, so I wanted to ask you a couple last questions, and I'm going to encourage folks too to use the Q&A function there for other questions you might have for Jordan. I wanted to ask you what you're working on now, not to take us away from rum, but I'm guessing, it's so unfair when people say you like the book is literally like it's just born, but nonetheless, this is how things go, right? You're surely already incubating some thoughts.
and I think many people know this, but like often you find your next project when you're working on the previous project. And so one of the
Yeah.
wilder experiences of work on this book was I did some work at the British Library in kind of the Martin family papers, which is a family who were kind of refugees of the English Civil War, settle in Suriname and then Antigua, grow in prominence in Antigua, and have kind of a hand in many really kind of big events around the Atlantic world. Everything from the Antigua slave conspiracy to Josiah Martin's the last royal governor of North Carolina.
Mm,
His niece writes nursery rhymes, including Old Mother Hubbard.
mm,
Um, a nephew is eviscerated by Burns in a poem. And so as I was kind of doing this reading, I'm reading some of this Martin correspondence, and I was trying to get through stuff as quickly as possible. And I would just pull up a volume. I wasn't probably doing my best work with with kind of guides. And all of a sudden, I'm reading about like somebody being shot in the stomach, and I learned that one of the family members, Samuel Martin's a member of Parliament, and he challenges John Wilkes to a duel in Hyde Park and shoots John Wilkes in the stomach, and they flee to they actually both have to flee to Paris, and they meet up in a hotel in Paris. Um, it's like so that's a wild part of a generally kind of expansive story of a family that's striving for kind of wealth and respectability and is often using different forms of violence to do so.
mm,
And so I'm trying to tell a kind of familial biography of the family and other families of the kind of central plantations, Greencastle Hill.
mhm.
Um, it's going to take a long time. I thought for a while I was like, oh, this will be like there's such this amazing collection at the British Library, and I realized there are amazing collections elsewhere that can help kind of untangle this story. So, um, I love spending time in the archive and working through things, but it's going to take some time.
That's great. I love that project. That's amazing. And we'll have to talk about upcoming JCB conference in 27, actually.
Oh, cool.
Um, but also I love your archive rat back there because I'm guessing like many of us feel that like that call because the learning is one of the greatest pleasures of life. And
Mhm.
yeah, it's great. Okay, so next question. What are you reading now? What are you reading that is like fun? And what are you reading that is, you know, the joy of learning?
So I'm going to be honest. I'm at a life stage right now where like the reading's a little
Wait,
bit different. So
I was
um,
going to say, wait a minute.
yeah. So
Yeah,
next week, my students and I in my a class I teach on piracy and history and fiction are reading Treasure Island, which is always a highlight of the year. I'm about to teach Michelle McDonald's brand new book, Coffee Nation. So
there we go.
that needs to be read.
Yeah,
And Michelle and I are both going to be in an event coming up too.
yeah.
And then I read a lot of children's books. So if anybody's looking for a book for like a kind of what I think is a new classic, I'd recommend Fry Bread. That's a favorite in our household right now.
That's excellent. That is excellent, Jordan. What did I not ask you that you wish I had? What would you like us to know about your book, about this work, about the research that we haven't talked about?
That's a really hard question. I think one thing that I was kind of prepared for was kind of the most surprising thing that I found in my research, and I
Oh
thought a lot
yes.
about that because again, with
Yeah.
kind of trying to kind of bring a lot of stuff together, I it's a harder question to think about. But I guess I the things that surprised me were kind of a couple fold. Like one thing that I would say to graduate students is kind of the most important part of writing a dissertation is the moment where you stop trying to write what you thought you were going to find and start writing like what the where the evidence leads you. And that's a really hard. That was a hard. Um, you can ask my advisor, Allison. That was a hard step to get over, and I think there were vestiges in the project really late into the process from that. And so the example was like I thought that if I looked hard enough, I could find a history of kind of a particular kind of group of people inventing rum, and that's not what the
Mm,
archive unveiled. And in my analysis unveiled, instead I unveiled what I ultimately call it creative collisions,
mhm,
and I think that reinforces this idea that the Atlantic world created, like all of these processes of enslavement, of colonization, of migration, of trade, created new worlds for everybody.
Hmm.
Um,
So
and then
rum
I
is not something that one group of people somehow have this secret knowledge and then they like share it with others and poof, it happens. But
no, and
rather, it's
again,
this like deep
yeah,
mutual layered process.
yeah, and I think that, and that's a place where different commodities kind of functioned differently.
Hmm.
But that, I think that's a really important, like I think that's a helpful thing for us to think about, and how kind of innovation kind of unfolded on the ground, not necessarily controlled by any individual group of people. And then just always moments where um, I was able to make these connections that I sometimes struggled with. So, and a lot of those when I was kind of skimming the book earlier to like think about some of those highlights, and I was thinking a lot about the moment I realized that the Cromanti word, so the word used by kind of Jamaican Maroon communities for rum, Insa, is an Akan or Fante word. Um,
Mm.
it's spelled differently, but I'm virtually certain the same word. And so like, there's a lot embedded in kind of those sorts of realizations. So maybe not like the exciting moments that like some people have been in the archive and seen when I like start silently fist pumping and like when I found something that I thought was really kind of interesting and helpful. And so that, yeah, those are some of the things that kind of energized my day during a long process of researching and writing this book.
Yeah, well, I loved the things you were sharing on the slides, some of those moments of like those signatures, those receipts. That's kind of amazing stuff. Like you see an actual person there. Yeah, that's really great. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing this book. And congratulations on it. I also read the blurbs on the back of the book, which are astonishing from Seth, from Sasha Turner, and also from Marcy, and really lovely, lovely, evocative descriptions of your book. So,
Thanks. I
congratulations.
think it shows how kind those three individuals are more than anything.
I think they liked reading the book. Anyway, it starts with that cracking anecdote about the auction. I just can't recommend that enough. Anyway, it made me look it up actually. So, all right.
It
Thank you,
was
George.
it
Oh,
was
yeah.
fun to cite the Daily Mail in the first chapter of my
Is it
dissertation
the first footnote?
or my book. I believe it might be. Yeah, I can't remember if it's the
God,
first, but
right.
yeah, that was fun.
Okay, well, if that's true, that's what's going to go out on our social media. Join us to our conversation with Jordan Smith, whose book had the first footnote is to the Daily Mail. Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much, Jordan.
Bye.
Take good
Thank
care.
you
And
all.
thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining us.